Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Schenk. I'm the Chief Museum Content Officer for the National Medal of Honor Museum. We're an organization that's looking to build a National Medal of Honor Museum in Arlington, Texas, and a Medal of Honor monument in Washington, D.C. And as we like to say, we are on a mission to inspire America. Today's featured author is a good friend of mine and a renowned military scholar. Welcome, Ed Lengel. Ed, good to see you.
Great to be here.
Ed is the Senior Director of Programs for the National World War II Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia, where he was a full professor and directed the Washington Papers Project for many years. He then served as Chief Historian of the White House Historical Association. Ed is also a professional author, speaker, and battlefield tour guide, and has written 14 books on American history, including General George Washington, A Military Life, and To Conquer Hell, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918. He's a co-recipient of the National Humanities Medal, and he's won 2 writing awards from the Army Historical Foundation. And he's made frequent television and radio appearances. Even most recently, if you guys saw the History Channel George Washington biography, he's one of the featured experts, rightfully so there. He's been on Sirius XM, National Public Radio, and many others. But today, we're gonna focus on one of Ed's newer books, Never in Finer Company. Here's my copy here. Really fantastic book on World War I. This is a book that really focuses on the men of the Lost Battalion, kind of one of the more famous episodes from World War I. And we're going to focus on a number of the Medal of Honor recipients that Ed covers here, but also the larger story. So Ed, let me kind of first start. I mean, I think we first met and you were a person who I got to know as really a George Washington and Revolutionary War expert. But here you are, you're writing all these fantastic books on World War I. I mean, what attracted you to kind of World War I as a historical subject?
I've been obsessed with World War I, and I don't think that's too strong a word, well before I got into the George Washington field. I'd say it goes back a good 30 years since I got into history in the first place, because for me, I'm most interested in the human experience of history. I think that empathy and compassion is vital to the study and the understanding of history. But I also believe that in individual personalities, we can find examples that we can relate to as people, that they can show us our own capacity, what we're able to do. It can inspire us to great things, but also kind of warn us against what we are potentially could be doing that's destructive. And I think World War I is a great example of that. It presents men and women in moments of intense crisis, danger, in a completely unprecedented world, something that they had no way of anticipating. And as we follow their personal stories, we can learn so much about ourselves. I just think this is a great field for that. But I also have to say there's a personal angle, because I'm proud to be related as a third cousin to Alvin York. That's something that's always been important in my family, as somebody we look up to with great admiration as a great inspiring figure.
That's fantastic. You know, Ed, in your book, I mean, you do such a fantastic job of bringing the era to life. And one of the things that becomes readily apparent, and particularly for a modern person who assumes that the United States is a perennial military superpower, I mean, your book kind of quickly shows that really in 1917, the United States is far from a military superpower, and yet we need to kind of create an army that's going to go to Europe to fight. I mean, can you kind of describe that situation and kind of the men of the Lost Battalion and maybe their path forward?
Absolutely, and I'm going to start with some illustrations here to kind of show us America at the time. You know, when the United States entered World War I, we were totally unprepared for warfare on this type of scale. President Woodrow Wilson had made assumptions, as had many Americans, that we were never going to get involved in this war. So that was one issue. Another issue was that America was at a tipping point in terms of change and transition, that we were at a point where we were standing at the cusp of a massive wave of immigration of people from parts of Europe, from Western, Eastern, South Central Europe, also from Asia and other parts of the world, had come into the United States, and in places like New York City and Chicago and other big cities. And most Americans were really not quite sure what to make of this. They weren't sure how it might change our national identity. They weren't certain what it would mean for the country in a time of crisis and a time of warfare. What were these immigrants going to do? Were they going to identify themselves as Americans? Were they going to cling to their old affiliations? And so when the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, it's a great deal of concern in the initial days and the initial months. We look back on this time from the vantage point of 100 years, and it seems to us like here, it's all parades and flags waving and everybody's patriotic. But in fact, in those early days, most Americans were deeply concerned that people seemed apathetic. They didn't seem interested in the war. They didn't seem to support their country. There was a fear of what these immigrants were going to do. And we found in our first month as participants in the war that volunteers were hard to come by. When that first month, I think some 40,000 Americans volunteered for military service, which is truly pathetic. So you can't build an army on that. We have to go to a national draft right away, whereas other countries had waited years before going to conscription. So we moved to the draft in May of 1917, and even then, as these soldiers begin to parade through places, these new draftees through places like New York City, they look nice in their uniforms, but what are they going to do? There's, to me, one of the great moments and examples in American history follows upon this. Now, a couple of years before we entered the war, former President Teddy Roosevelt and some others had initiated something called the Plattsburgh movement. This was named after a place in New York where the first so-called Plattsburgh camp was established. Now, the idea behind the Plattsburgh camps was that men of privileged backgrounds, the bankers, the lawyers, the professors, the people who had it pretty good, stockbrokers and all the rest, would, even before the United States was in the war, would go into these camps, learn basic principles of physical fitness, of drill, of training, things like that. But even more than that, they were expected to learn civic responsibility, sacrifice, these principles that those to whom much is given, much will be asked. So through these camps in 1915 and 1916, these privileged young men were taught to sacrifice themselves and to lead, to be responsible for their country. And so when the war begins and the United States enters the war, these men come back. They join the military again. They go into officers' training camps with that example of service and sacrifice. And they are the ones who are appointed to lead these uncertain soldiers who have come to form the American Expeditionary Forces.
And Ed, you really, the book does focus on this one division, the 77th, the Metropolitans, which you showed a great picture of them marching in New York. That you focus on a couple of the leaders in this story, Charles Whittlesey and George McMurtry. And so maybe tell us about kind of their path and kind of a little bit about them as they entered service here.
Yeah, these men are shining examples of those principles that were taught at Plattsburgh. And in fact, both men are graduates of the Plattsburgh camp. These are unlikely heroes. The man on the left of the screen with the glasses is Charles Whittlesey. Charles Whittlesey doesn't look like a warrior, does he?
No, he doesn't.
Doesn't look like somebody who's born to military service, and he wasn't. He was an idealistic young intellectual who had gone to Williams College in Massachusetts. Then he had gone to Harvard Law School, become a successful New York City lawyer, idealistic, as I said, to the point that he dabbles in radical politics. He's interested in socialism, But he goes to the Plattsburgh camps in 1915, 1916. He learns those principles of service and sacrifice for his country. And in 1917, even though there's no expectation that he has to go off and serve, he immediately decides to go to officers training camp and to seek military service as an officer. He becomes an officer in the 77th Division, 308th Regiment, and becomes one of those men responsible for training these immigrant soldiers in the New York 77th Division, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Now, the man on the right, Captain George McMurtry, is in some ways even more of an unlikely warrior in World War I, although he had had previous military service. He was from an Irish American family. His father was an immigrant who had gone from rags to riches and had come to run collieries in Western Pennsylvania. So he grew up, George did, fairly wealthy. He saw some service in the Spanish-American War, but he also graduated from Harvard Law School. And he decides to become a stockbroker in New York City. By the time the United States enters World War I, George McMurtry is in his 40s. He's a millionaire.
Wow. Yeah, he's old.
Yeah, he's old. He's already served his country, but he's also gone to Plattsburgh, and he's met Charles Whittlesey there. He also has a passionate belief in public service. He doesn't hesitate. He also goes and joins and becomes an officer in the same regiment and battalion as Charles Whittlesey.
That's amazing. That's great to see these two here.
Yeah. And
so
then
advance the story. So Ed, so now there's also, as you're about to show here, there's really kind of a third Medal of Honor recipient, one that maybe more Americans know by name.
Right.
The one you mentioned, that's a relation of yours.
Yeah, he seems, Alvin York comes, it seems, out of a totally different background from Whittlesey and McMurtry, and I just wanted to touch on him before we move on with the 77th Division. Now, just as all of these young men are either being drafted or they're signing up and all over the country in places like New York, also another part of America on your left is Fentress County, Tennessee. This is obviously a later picture because you see a car in the background. It's from the Great Depression. This remained for most of the 20th century the most impoverished county in the United States.
Yeah, that doesn't look like Manhattan.
Does not. Totally contrast, doesn't it? But this is where my mom's family is from. Alvin York grows up in poverty. These are people who are, very familiar with hardship and suffering. They're also familiar with violence. And Alvin York, as a young man, is very familiar with violence. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of rivalries. He sees one of his friends killed in a knife fight right before his eyes. Storytelling is important to him, but these are also people to whom faith is extremely important as a means of turning away from their poverty and the violence that they experience. So that's true for York. He converts to a Bible-believing denomination before the war. When the United States enters the war, he has no desire to go and fight. He's drafted. Those of you've probably seen the movie Sergeant York. You know that he deeply debates within himself and others whether God would allow him to fight before finally being convinced that he can. But I think there's another element to this here. We'll get more into York's psychology later on. I think deep down, York was afraid of himself. He was afraid. When you put him in a military context, you put him in battle, that something would trigger him, that something would take him back to who he had been.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting part of your book, Ed, is that I think a lot of people have this more simplistic notion of York as a Bible thumper, conscientious objector. You really point out that he's a man very accustomed to firearms and weapons, and someone who's had really probably a far rougher upbringing than many others.
Yeah, and it was something that he wanted very much to turn away from, and he felt if he got into combat, he might lose everything that he had fought so hard to gain. I think that's a backstory to it.
And York joins the 82nd Division as different from the other two in the 70s.
That's right. Yeah, and I should say on the 77th Division, as we move into the Western Front, that Whittlesey and McMurtry are in. The 77th Division is an all draftee division. It's the first all draftee American division ever to see combat. And it is made up mostly of men from greater New York City area. These are like newspaper vendors, fruit cart pushers, street gangsters, all the rest. York is put in the 82nd All-American Division, which is the ancestor to the 82nd Airborne.
Right.
That's also an all draftee division made up of men from all over the country and all different backgrounds.
It is sort of interesting. They're called the All-American, and as you point out, it's a true melting pot of cultures and languages and first-generation people of all sorts.
Very true. Yes. So here we have General John J. Pershing. You see on the left is also one of his generals, Charles Summerall, to the right and the front, who would command the 1st Division. The 77th and 82nd Divisions are sent over to Europe in the spring of 1918. Now they enter an environment which is partly defined by Pershing. Pershing is a passionate believer that Americans are special, that there's an American way of war, that the way to break the stalemate on the Western Front in the trenches is through the attack. It's the individual American soldier with his rifle who's going to win this conflict. And he believes that the French and the British have become demoralized and corrupted by sitting in trenches and relying on artillery. So that almost a cult of the attack is going to very much define what the 77th and 82nd experience.
Absolutely. So Ed, you in your book, all the characters in these 2 divisions have finally made it to France. They've been brought to the front. They've been going through a little bit of seasoning, if you will, to use that term. And as you point out, Pershing's eager to kind of employ the Americans in some decisive way. Kind of describe maybe the setup to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which is where many of these will earn their heroism, their renown.
Sure. Well, the American experience on the Western Front in World War I just want to remind everybody, may have been short, but it was very intense, very, very intense. The Americans experienced combat in World War I in all of its intensity, all of its brutality, that every aspect that the Europeans did just over a shorter period of time. And the casualties reflect that. We'll talk about the Meuse-Argonne in a moment. Over the first 3 weeks of that battle, American troops suffered approximately 26,000 killed in action and over 100,000 casualties. That in 3 weeks. So this was intense, very intense. The first battles, so the first major battle American troops are ever involved in overseas was the Battle of Belleau Wood in June. And U.S. Marines and soldiers as well are involved in that. A whole series of other actions over the course of the spring and the summer as the Americans work with the British and French to slowly push the Germans back. Pershing's goal is to form a single American army that will occupy its own sector of the front. He achieves that in August. There's a Battle of Saint-Mihiel in early September. That's a significant victory. But then the ultimate objective is a major offensive, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, beginning September 26, 1918, aimed at a major railway junction that will help to cut off German forces from supply on the Western Front. This is and remains the largest battle in the history of the United States military, with well over 1 million men involved in this single battle. And as I indicated, well over 100,000 casualties.
It's remarkable. It's just epic in terms of its size.
Very epic. And this is where the 77th Division enters into major combat. The other American divisions in the lines initially are many of them National Guard divisions, regular Army divisions. There are some draftees, but the first major combat experienced by an American all draftee division. 77th, right here, in the worst
That
part
doesn't
of
be a good place to make an attack.
my goodness. I mean, you can still see it today, and I've spent a lot of time on the battlefields over there. Now, other divisions are put in somewhat better areas to advance. Your draftee division, 77th, you're going to put on the worst part, say this is the terrain you have to attack in, the Argonne Forest.
Wow.
So it was intense stuff.
And
And
as you point out, by Pershing standard, and clearly you can see it in all the general officers, they all seem to kind of espouse it, this spirit of attack and this really kind of aggressiveness. And I guess for anyone who knows a little bit about World War One, there's such incredible defensive weapons, machine guns, artillery, gas. It just seems like they're being sent to their doom just based on kind of the spirit of Elan, I guess is what Pershing's hoping for.
yeah, but that's all true. But you think about it, there's something that's terrifying, but there's also something inspiring here, because German defenders are veterans, and they're fighting hard, even though the war is not too far from being over. The Germans are still fighting hard. So 77th is put here in the Argonne. They're ordered to attack straight ahead into the Argonne. Now remember, these are all draftees. Remember, these are men who, many of them don't even speak good English. Some of them have not even been naturalized citizens yet at this point. And they're told to attack straight ahead, and they do not hesitate. They attack, and they attack, and they attack, back and forth, day after day. Other American divisions are relieved. Of the 9 divisions that make the initial assault, 8 are relieved within the first several days. Which one is not relieved? The 77th Division. It's ordered to keep on ahead. And these men, under terrible conditions, they fight with incredible bravery. And it's almost as if they feel they have something to prove. They've been drafted. Yes, many of them are from other countries, or their parents are, but they feel they need to prove that they're Americans, that they love their country, that they're willing to make sacrifices for it.
And so this division is in the face of great odds, is making progress in this attack, and the 77th is kind of getting deeper into the German position.
So as September moves into early October, Charles Whittlesey, who is now a major of the 1st Battalion, 308th Regiment, and George McMurtry, who is captain of Company E, are continuing their advance. They've taken heavy casualties. Whittlesey protests at one point and says, this is ridiculous. You need to give us a chance to develop this attack. Our men are exhausted, but he's ordered to keep ahead. He is told on October 2nd, 1918, to advance once more into the forest to seize an objective which is on the far side of a ravine and then German-held territory. Whittlesey says, well, what about my flanks? He's told in no uncertain terms, don't worry about your flanks. They're not your business, in effect. If you don't see anybody on your flanks supporting you, just assume that they're there. Keep moving ahead no matter what. Whittlesey, again, the amateur soldier with McMurtry by his side, say, yes, sir, we will do this. They advance. That day, simply by accident, the Germans have shifted some of their forces in another area. They accidentally leave a gap in their lines. Their battalion moves straight through this gap, takes their objective. Whittlesey settles down, and then he recognizes, oh no, there was nobody on my flanks. I've advanced into German territory. The Germans seal the gap, cut them off, and surround them. And what happens over the next several days, to me, is one of the most inspiring stories in the history of our country.
I mean, what's amazing about this, Ed, is that they're already beat up by this point. They've already gone through tremendous combat, taking casualties, and now they're surrounded in what seems like a most lethal position with trained, experienced troops all around them.
That's right. You have about 600 men, elements of two battalions, really, although it was called a single battalion. And they have not taken rations before their advance. They have no food. They have no medical supplies. They have no medical practitioners, no medics, no field surgeons, and nothing. They don't have any water except what's in their canteens. And these are, again, a mixture of men from all over New York. But another irony is, right before this final attack, a group of replacements had come in from the Western Plains states of ranchers and farmers and cowboys who are mixed in with these Brooklyn boys and Manhattan street toughs. So they don't have necessarily that unit identity yet. And now they're surrounded and attacked on all sides by the Germans day after day. They're hit by German infantry attacks with flamethrowers, grenades, machine guns. German trench mortar pounds them. And in a final indignity, they're hit by their own artillery.
I couldn't believe that. Just imagine you're getting friendly fire in addition to all these other challenges. And you even describe it, because this is an interesting picture in front of us. I would say they're in a foxhole, but the terminology in World War I, those are called when you're dug in like this.
Funk holes, so they call
them. Funk holes, that's right. I thought that was a very interesting term. It's different from today's military.
Interesting thing about this picture, we'll get back to the subject a little bit later. This picture was not taken at the time of the Lost Battalion defense, but was taken a year later. And these men are veterans of the Lost Battalion who were told to go back to the site where they had fought and to make a silent movie.
Wow.
Of what they had experienced there. Now imagine that. And this is a frame from that movie. You see the expressions on their faces. Those are not actors' expressions. Those are real expressions. Yeah. So it's a situation where these men learn fairly quickly that they only have two things that they can depend on. And the first thing is each other. The soldiers of the Lost Battalion, from whatever their backgrounds, these are guys, if they'd been in New York City before the war, if they'd seen each other on the other side of the street, they're Irish or Italian or whatever, they would have been happy to cross over and beat the crap out of each other.
Right.
Had nothing in common with these Western farmers, and yet they bond totally and completely. They become absolutely reliant on each other, dependent on each other. There's men who sacrifice their lives in order to get a drink of water for their wounded buddy. There's a spring.
You described that. The only drinking water was an exposed position, subject to sniper fire and machine gun fire. And you just read about all the degradation, no food, weak medical supplies, the constant attacks. Yet you showcase in the book too how Whittlesea and McMurtry and some of the other officers really play a central role in holding this group together.
That's right. This is the second thing that they have to depend upon is their officers. And Charles Whittlesey, on your right, is one of them. There's an interesting principle at work here. When the Lost Battalion is cut off, Whittlesea's regimental commander, his brigade commander, and his divisional commander all have one thing in common. They say, it's not my responsibility. It's not my fault. They're all concerned with defending themselves against criticism or blame, and they all try to shift the blame to somebody else. With Whittlesea and with McMurtry and with their other officers who are in the pocket, one thing they all have in common is they take responsibility. They say, well, I may not have been personally responsible but for getting us into this situation, but now it is my responsibility. These men are my responsibility, and I must do everything I can to get them out, no matter what. And you see that with Whittlesey, just that total dedication to his men. And McMurtry as well. McMurtry is wounded several times. He's Whittlesey's rock, moving back and forth through the pocket. Whittlesey's, again, not a military man. He's not always clear what to do, but he crawls from funk hole to funk hole, from shell hole to shell hole, night after night. He doesn't sleep, fighting to encourage his men. Keep going. We can get through this. He leaves no stone unturned to help them out. And tragically, the only moment that he does briefly fall asleep in the pocket is when he's crawled into a funk hole with one of his privates who's mortally wounded, and briefly falls asleep. And then when he wakes up, he finds that he's cheek to cheek with a dead man, with a private has died during the night. And it's something obviously that Whittlesey would never forget. But the example of dedication, despite not necessarily having the knowledge and the skills, but total self-sacrifice, is really what gets him through.
And Ed, when in the account and when you read the story that you've crafted here, I mean, one of the other very powerful parts of the episode is that the Germans do offer the opportunity to surrender. They kind of were hoping that this cut-off battalion that they see as a hopeless circumstance, they offer a chance to surrender. Yet, what is McMurtry and Whittlesey's response there?
So there are a couple of things going on that, as you can imagine, many of these men are wounded, badly wounded. One of them, one of Whittlesey's lieutenants, a Lieutenant Maurice Wren, his foot has been shattered. It's in pieces, and there's been no medical attention. As the days pass, the excruciating pain gets worse. They're worried about infection. And Maurice Wren and a sergeant and another private who are in a funk hole together, they start saying, well, maybe we just need to give up, because men are going to die. And they talk to Whittlesey about it, and Whittlesey just very quietly kind of shuts them up and says, we're not going to talk about that now. Our only goal now is to hold out. But he doesn't criticize him or remonstrate with him so much as he just says, no, we're not doing that. The Germans also capture an American soldier who they send back to the pocket with an offer of surrender toward the end. Whittlesey and McMurtry look at it, pass it around. The legend goes up that Whittlesey said, go to hell. That's not true. He just kind of smiled. And as he and his officers look at it, they're so exhausted, they just start laughing, and they just toss the note away. They won't surrender.
I mean, it's, again, going back to just resilience. I mean, these officers and these men really just showcase that as one of the character virtues here.
That's right. That's right. And that to me is just a great shining example, especially considering that these are not professionals.
Right, exactly. I mean, these are lawyers and stockbrokers.
That's right. That's right.
So now the story shifts, and again, the third great military character is Alvin York, and here I think you got a picture of him. It's like he's standing in the snow. I'm not sure if that is the case. Yeah.
This is Alvin York coming back to the site where his exploit for which he would receive the Medal of Honor took place. And how does York come into the story is that the Lost Battalion has been holding out for 5 days. It's October 7th, 1918. And the American General Hunter Liggett comes up with the idea that, the Lost Battalion is going to be destroyed if we don't do something about it. So he launches a couple of divisions into a flanking attack into the German positions in the Argonne. One of those divisions is the 82nd Division, and Alvin York, then a corporal, is leading one of the first patrols into German-held territory in this American assault. He and his group of soldiers work their way into the German rear area to kind of narrow this down to what's a very long story. They capture a group of Germans, and they're rounding them up and preparing to take them out, including some German officers, soldiers, and all the rest. German machine guns, however, and placed on the ridge above, see what's happening, and they open fire on the Americans and the Germans both. York sees his best friend, a man named Savage, literally shot to pieces in front of his eyes. And the other men hit the deck. Many of them are killed. And just what York had anticipated would happen happens. The switch turns, and York becomes who he was. The man of his past, the man familiar with violence. He gets stone cold. He works his way up a ridge. He, being the excellent marksman that he was, he takes the German machine guns in his sights and shoots down the Germans one man at a time, one headshot after another, and wipes out the machine gunners. Then a German squad attacks him. They see him. They launch a frontal attack. He shoots them down one at a time. Until finally a remaining German officer says, "If you stop the killing, I'll tell my men to surrender."
That's amazing.
And York is not like, "Oh, well, yeah, I guess so." He's not a hillbilly type. He looks at this officer stone cold and he says, "You better."
Yeah.
Holds a gun to his head. The German prisoners come out, they surrender, and another part of the story that's not often told is a couple of these Germans, just kids, teenagers, try to play hero. They try to catch York off guard. York shoots them down right in front of his face without mercy, and captures 132 men, takes them back.
And how many Americans are here with York at this time when he's got the 132 captured?
He has approximately a squad of men with him. Some of them help him round up the Germans, but this is primarily York's exploit.
Wow, remarkable.
And really, this is one of the things. This exploit cracks the German lines and will lead directly to the relief of the Lost Battalion. But look, in the day after this happens, York is not celebrating. He feels awful. And he gets 2 stretcher bearers. He goes back down to the battlefield and he's calling out for survivors. Is anybody still alive? American, German, he doesn't care which. He can't find anybody. He's racked with guilt. Now, this will affect him later on.
Because I think you or others have pointed out that even in this division, he's this kind of rural guy from Eastern Tennessee, yet he's now with different cultures and different types of people. Yet he seems to kind of connect with these people. There does seem to be a bonding.
He does. In some ways, he's just as much of an outsider as they are.
Yeah.
Because, and I know this from my connections with the people, that part of the country is very isolated. They have, in Tennessee, East Tennessee, they've been cut off for generations. Other people mock them and make fun of them as hillbillies. They're not treated as real Americans. So I think York bonds with these immigrants. Say, I know what it's like to be an outsider.
But his exploits here are just remarkable. And again,
Sure.
it's hard to kind of be inside his head as to notions of fear, but he appears to be just methodical is almost one of the words that comes to mind, and aggressive.
He's methodical, but he's also savage. And every now and then he lets his guard down. There was an interview after the war in a newspaper I found in which York lets his guard down, and he told a reporter, that he kind of enjoyed hearing the Germans squeal like pigs, when they were bayoneted, because there's still that element of him inside, that old ruthless element. And I say this of a man who I love and admire, who I think is a great example, but he was human above all.
And Ed, I think you describe in the book too. I mean, this is a man who at the start of the war didn't know whether he could wield a rifle against another human. And now he's gone through this, but yet when he's asked about what it was like to kill the enemy, he doesn't seem to have much regret there.
Right. He's a conflicted man. There's no doubt that his faith was genuine. There was no doubt that his desire to be good was genuine, but he was also deep down a man filled with contradictions that he was trying to resolve all of his life.
Remarkable.
One other character I want to mention here, an unlikely hero, comes into the story, and is vital really to bringing this story home. And this is Damon Runyon. Damon Runyon was an American sports writer, also a man of impoverished origins, grown up in the West, had been an alcoholic, had gone sober, but then become a chain smoker, which would kill him later.
Yeah.
Goes to New York City and becomes one of the great sports writers in American history. He later wrote the collection of stories, Guys and Dolls, that became a famous Broadway hit. He's a chronicler of New York City, but he's interested in human stories. When the 77th Division is formed, Runyon has a lot of friends there. He loves walking the streets of the city. He follows the division into training, and then follows the division over to France. And here's a guy, again, he's not a professional war correspondent. He never intended to be that, but he goes right to the front. There's an account of a soldier sitting in a shell hole and, under fire in the middle of the night, and he hears somebody squelching through the mud, and rolls into the shell hole next to him. And it's this dapper little guy in his uniform, now covered with mud. Says, "I'm Damon Runyon, and I'm from the New York, and a newspaper correspondent. I want to hear your story." It's just the way he was. But he then, right as the Lost Battalion is liberated, October 8th, they come out. Damon Runyon is there, and he doesn't want to hear what the generals are saying. He doesn't want to hear the official story. He goes right to Charles Whittlesey, right to George McMurtry, says, "I want to hear your story." And he's the one who will bring their story, and Alvin York's story too, back home to Americans.
I mean, that part of your account, Ed, just left me with my head shaking. Just, here's this Lost Battalion that just gone through this horrific event, and they're being paraded in front of the military brass, and they're being told to clean up their uniforms and get prepared for kind of photographs or video or whatever. And these guys just want to be left alone. And yet here they are being kind of, put forward as these immediate heroes.
Yeah. And, McMurtry and Whittlesea are there, and all they're thinking about is their men. They're thinking about what they've experienced and how they can help their men. When other reporters, not Runyon, but others, go to Whittlesea and they say, "You're the hero of this story," they go to McMurtry, who's shown here, say, "You're the hero. Tell me why you're a hero." They say, "Don't talk about me. Talk about the men."
Right.
That's all that matters. But you can see, just by in these next series of photos, I think you can see a little bit, just without words, you can see in their faces what they're feeling.
So Ed, is this McMurtry on his way home on a ship, or?
Yeah, this is George McMurtry returning home on shipboard from combat duty in World War I, and this picture is very powerful.
Yeah,
and I think anybody, but especially any combat veteran, will understand just by looking in his eyes. You can see what he's feeling. Charles Whittlesey as well. You see him right after the action. Though he wears his glasses, he's not the man he was. He's not that fresh-faced lawyer that I showed earlier on. You can see the fatigue. And Alvin York too. So many of the pictures we see of Alvin York are posed, and he's treated as a hero when he comes home, like the rest of them. But when you catch him off guard, like in a picture like this, you can see it. You can see what he's feeling. Each of these men receives a Medal of Honor, York, Whittlesey, and McMurtry, and they're paraded as heroes when they get back to America. But ultimately, each of them, is feeling the combat. They've been there, and they're not really interested in the celebrity treatment, but they have to deal with it.
Yeah, it seems like Whittlesey in particular has a real hard time with kind of the press wanting to kind of tease out patriotic comments from him.
Yeah, Whittlesey doesn't want to talk. He he tries to deflect the reporters. He tries to deflect the attention as much as he can. McMurtry doesn't need to deal with it as much because he's viewed as kind of Whittlesea's number two. All the attention is on Whittlesea. Whittlesea, instead of accepting the celebrity, he tries even more to devote himself to his men. We have to remember this is a time when there was really no aid for veterans, no significant aid. There was no recognition of post-traumatic stress, of the difficulties of readjusting to civilian life and getting jobs. And so they had to depend on each other. And, you know, for many of these survivors, and only a third of the men who went into that pocket came out on their own feet.
Wow.
Others killed or wounded. They do what's natural. They're dealing with stress, with alcoholism, with fatigue, with trying to readjust. So they go back to Whittlesea and they say, look, Major, you know, I can't put myself together anymore. I don't know what to do. And Whittlesea continues to try to help them, you know, any way he can. He's got nightmares every night. He can't sleep well. He can't readjust, but he continues to sacrifice until it wears him totally down. So it's a challenging time for all of them. No, and it really, for each of them, I think it comes together in November of 1921, November 11th, 1921, at the internment of the unknown soldier in Arlington, Virginia. And this is a set of unidentified remains who have been chosen at random to represent the American courage and sacrifice in this war. And he's brought back, and to much fanfare, he's interred in Arlington Cemetery, and of course he can still go there today. And dozens of Medal of Honor recipients from this war and previous wars are put there on a podium and to witness it, and including Whittlesey, McMurtry, and York. They're all there, and they're all watching this happen. And during the ceremony, Whittlesey turns to McMurtry, his best friend, and he says, George, I shouldn't have come. I can't help but feel that's one of my men who I left there in the pocket being buried right now. And I'm going to hear their cries tonight. You know, you can just feel what he was feeling. Now, here's a man, you know, I think of Charles Whittlesey. Here's, by any definition, a hero.
Right.
A man who's, you know, sacrificed everything for his men. He took totally seriously the idea of public service, self-sacrifice. And yet he, like so many other veterans, he blames himself. He blames himself for every single man who was lost in that pocket. And that's how he meets his own end. That after the unknown soldier's internment, he goes one evening to see this silent movie on the Lost Battalion that he had been forced to act in. You can still see this today. And McMurtry had been forced to appear in it as well. He goes to see it. The next day, he boards a steamer bound for Cuba, where he has no business. That evening, he talks to some men in the captain's quarters about the Army-Navy football game. Everything seems normal. Goes back to his cabin, writes a series of notes in sealed envelopes, leaves them on his desk. Then he goes out and steps overboard, and he's lost, just like his men.
Such a sad ending to such a brave man.
Yeah. He was as much a casualty as them. He couldn't forget them. So, you know, I think this is an example of somebody who was destroyed by it.
Now, Ed, what I find interesting about York, as you show a picture here, York, who is the least sophisticated of the trio, seems to be the one who thrives the most almost in this post-war period.
That's right. George McMurtry, just to mention what he did is he was definitely scarred by this, destroyed his marriage and his family. His personality had changed by all accounts. He devotes himself entirely for the rest of his life to the Lost Battalion Survivors Association. And at the end of every meeting, going well into the 1950s, he raises a glass and he reminds his men of something Whittlesey had said when they saw their men marching out of the pocket, and when he had said, "George, we'll never be in finer company than we are right now." And so McMurtry repeats that at every meeting. But York, here again, York to me is the inspiration. He is equally tormented, equally feeling guilty for what he had done, and yet he finds a way out. He goes back home. He accepts his celebrity, but he accepts it for a purpose. He has a couple of biographies that are written about him, treating him as a hero. There's the movie with Gary Cooper. There's all the other plaudits and everything. He's given a farm. He's given other stuff. He says, "I'll take your money, but I'll only take your money for one purpose. Every single penny will go to the Alvin York Foundation to help the poor people of East Tennessee and to help to lift them up." And it's in that he finds renewed purpose, that he's able to find meaning, and he's able to take the pain and the suffering and the guilt, and he's able to turn it into good. That to me is tremendously inspiring. And I've met his family. His son is still alive. These are some of the most joyful, wonderful people you could ever know, and they look to his example. And I think it's an example for all of us.
I mean, it's a remarkable journey for a man, as you describe, Ed, who grew up in extremely humble rural circumstances, not worldly at all, and yet he's on a world stage. And you describe kind of the movie Sergeant York, which many of us have probably seen. That comes out right before Pearl Harbor, and it's York seems to be very actively promoting a more interventionist sort of position, even prior to Pearl Harbor, which I found to be also kind of an interesting legacy of his.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast from what he had been before, but I think he had come to terms with the contradictions and the feelings he had had earlier, and he had become more realistic on the one hand, but also more in love with his country, and recognizing that sacrifice and duty were extremely important. So he changes over in that respect, but he's also still a family loving man. He's still somebody who understands first principles.
It's a tremendous story.
And I'll just mention, I just want to say one word about Damon Runyon, because Damon Runyon did not receive a Medal of Honor, but in many ways, he wraps up the story, I think, of these four men, and of New York City, too. Damon Runyon will die in 1946 of throat cancer from all that smoking. Right. And in his will, he designates his good friend, another Medal of Honor recipient, another great American, Eddie Rickenbacker, to take Damon Runyon's ashes and fly out over New York City with those ashes when Runyon's son will empty them illegally, I might mention. He does it anyway over Times Square. And wow. He said, Runyon says in testimony to the city that's been so good to me and which I love so well. And I like that image in that winter sky over New York City. Runyon is merging together himself, the war in the form of Eddie Rickenbacker, and each of those millions of individual stories, melding them together into that big city, into America, as those ashes float down. I think that was deliberate. He's saying each of these goes together to unite us into one city and one country.
Tremendous. So Ed, what a fantastic kind of journey through this amazing episode, this Lost Battalion episode, which, so well covered in your book. And again, just want to highlight the book here, Never in Finer Company. Really no finer book, I might add, on the subject, and something that you'll find has got so many interesting, nuanced stories and subjects within it, so much to take away. And again, remembering, the 3 Medal of Honor recipients that are at its center, in addition to Runyon, who tells their stories, but, for Whittlesea and McMurtry and York, these are still stories that now 101 years later are still worth remembering and knowing. So thank you, Ed, for telling them, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you.